The year 2020 will be remembered for centuries to come, the year the entire world came to a standstill because of a virus. The year people started to abandon the city and look to live in closer harmony with nature. The year that the clear skies and lack of mass gatherings made people truly appreciate wildlife and their natural surroundings. The year that working in an office became obsolete. The year when realizing you have everything you need on your doorstep became a reality. The year when people realized that they did not need to have a stressful routine to be happy. The year people found they wanted to work less and spend more quality time doing things they enjoyed. Because of the pandemic, people the world over have had to readjust their expectations. Many businesses have shut down either temporarily or permanently. In several countries, the economy has gone into freefall. People's jobs have been affected and hundreds of thousands have had to learn new skills in a matter of months in order to survive. The cost of living has also increased. Governments have had no other alternative but to supply money to support their economies. And they are now having to deal with very high levels of debt. It was a nightmare year, but not for everyone. Market sectors for video conferencing and teleworking platforms, recreation, electronics, subscriptions and food delivery applications and services have enjoyed an especially good year, thanks to the increase in the use of the internet. The COVID-19 pandemic and the ensuing measures to contain the virus spread have dramatically changed the world we live in. As the actions aimed at reducing the spread of the virus are critical to containing the pandemic, particularly in the absence of vaccines, we explore these consequences in detail. Specific topics considered include: has COVID-19 reset the clock of globalization evolution? Is the demise of powerful economic cities and the return to localism and protectionism to be anticipated? Was the amazing capacity of one country to export medical equipment and to act as the global buffer in the manufacture of medical protective equipment a transient event? And how far is the supply chain of the vaccine shaping and driving international relations? The answer to these questions is intimately linked and has an impact on international relations in the post-COVID-19 era in a way that may last over time. The battle to develop a vaccine has so far been a manifestation of a mix of competition and cooperation, where national interest appears at the heart of the race. In the process, interdependencies are abolished, and funding for biomedical research is one declaration of war in the fight against pandemics, as well as one of the weapons to combat returning self-confining nationalistic inclinations. The globalization induced by the pandemic will thus shape the post-COVID-19 New World Order. Although it is absolutely clear that the methodologies burst and the growth of complex networks that characterized the beginning of the 21st century were made possible by the globalization process. The return to a previous era is neither feasible nor beneficial, given the presence of higher connectivity associated with improved healthcare networks, the activities of new organized criminal agents, the quick spread of rumors, the ability to manipulate information to large audiences, and the reduced cost associated with travel in a more interconnected world. Globalization also exposed states to new and unexpected risks. The novel coronavirus originated in Wuhan, China, and managed to spread to all corners of the globe within a matter of weeks or months. By the end of March 2020, the disease had spread to nearly 200 countries and territories. It only took 6 weeks for infections to jump from China to the rest of the world, as health authorities detected the first local outbreak in late February. Soon after, reports from other countries confirmed that infections were spreading like wildfire outside of Wuhan. By mid-March 2020, the principal spread in Europe had come from Italy, fueling restrictions on the movement of people within the Schengen area. Most of the confirmed cases in Iran were traced back to China, which explained the country's COVID-19 infections due to the high number of exchanges they had during the Lunar New Year. The outbreak in South Korea has also been shown to be due to the influx of a large number of travelers at the end of January and the beginning of February. The COVID-19 pandemic began in the city of Wuhan in China's Hubei province at the end of December 2019. Both the scientific evidence and basic logic argue that the outbreak began earlier than that. The evidence suggests that there were cases in early December. Authorities just failed to notice them. Some argue that the outbreak started inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology as a result of a laboratory-related incident and was then covered up. Simply put, neither the scientific evidence nor the basic logic supports the lab leak hypothesis. The pandemic being of natural origin is what all the available scientific evidence tells us. Nevertheless, for as long as the authorities withhold critical data and evidence remains circumstantial, a degree of uncertainty remains. The mainstream hypothesis is that the outbreak began in the Huanan seafood wholesale market, but it could also have started elsewhere in the city. It apparently took some time before the authorities in Wuhan realized that they were experiencing a really unusual cluster of pneumonia cases. The pandemic has shaken the world, rapidly bringing into focus systemic problems and critical issues that are faced not only at the national level but also globally. The immediate healthcare system response was to build hospitals, create isolation facilities, train staff, improve regime adherence, adopt an evidence-based approach and collect data. The speed of the response cannot be overemphasized. Public health systems had a first trial run in addressing previous health crises and learned a lot, but nothing like the immense task faced during the pandemic. Different countries adopted different stances and strategies according to their demographic, economic, and political characteristics. Some focused on tracing, testing, and isolation. Some dispersed people first. Other countries adopted various theories and delayed meaningful action. After the initial lesson, wider testing, refining intervention models, changing lockdown types, and practicing uniting the people-style interventions followed. Little was done to review national strategies and to correct initial wrong moves. However, perspectives are starting to slowly shift toward a wider interest, and social transactions are finding balance during this global health crisis. With unique constraints arising from the public health emergency, we have seen unprecedented innovations in vaccine development, testing, financing, and health system applications. Returning once more to the key lesson, when the pressure is high and motivation strong, much can be achieved. Historically, it has taken from 1 to 2 decades from the identification of a pandemic-causing pathogen to the approval of a vaccine. Despite the never-before reduction in approval time to a year or less, the vaccine doses themselves typically failed to arrive soon enough that epidemic damages could be averted. The hurdle for immediate, inexpensive, large-scale testing was even more daunting. Before coping with the unwitting passage of the virus to humans, there had been no successful commercial ventures to screen patients for both the old and the new polystrains of coronaviruses. The development of useful and inexpensive tests was always going to be difficult. To develop, test and manufacture tests in huge amounts, when neither the public expectation nor financial incentives to succeed were high, were unprecedented tasks that were and are still not believed to have been completed. The drive to develop, test and distribute handheld testing technologies, including in some low-income countries with weak public health delivery systems, is to be further applauded. The economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have been equally profound, reflecting both the nature of the biological threat and the severity of the measures taken to combat it. Recovery will require a combination of economic strategies and extensive reforms aimed at increasing the resilience of country systems and greater international collaboration to address global priorities. The economic ramifications of the global health crisis will cause significant distress for at least a number of years. The result will be a slowdown in global growth, reversing some of the impressive gains in global living standards over recent decades. These economic impacts will trigger social and political disturbances that will contribute to an era characterized by deglobalization, nationalism, and declining multilateral collaboration. Economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic will come in 5 stages: survival, regeneration, sharing, reshaping, and reform. The early policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic largely focused on the survival stage. They had three interrelated objectives: to protect people in both health and economic terms, to preserve the integrity of the country's socio-economic infrastructures, and to ensure governments and thus the country could continue to fulfill their normal responsibilities. The success of the early policy responses has largely been achieved through government actions, including fiscal policy designed to ensure appropriate public health responses and support business enactments. Although these responses have been appropriate and generally effective, the state of public finances in all countries will be stretched for at least a decade. Global markets and industries. The pandemic has accelerated existing trends and opened the way for disruptive change. To capture the shifting competitive landscape, we revisited the prospective value pools first identified in 2017. Our updated analysis highlights the intensity of the competitive pressure on corporations and the scope for further creative destruction. Certain sectors have seen dramatic growth in demand, especially the technology, media, and telecom and pharmaceutical sectors, while others face a dramatic reduction in demand, such as the automotive, commercial aerospace, and energy sectors. No consumer-focused sector can expect to return to pre-crisis spending levels. We also probed the pandemic's impact on major economies and explained the implications for global value pools. A combination of a V-shaped economic recovery and structural changes post-crisis would lead to a new world order, in economic weight terms finally reaching the tipping point when advanced economies no longer represent both the majority of world GDP and the largest share of prospective global value pools. The focus of management and investment has been on near-term resilience, but equally striking is how far long-term value creation prospects have shifted across companies and sectors. The prospects of some sectors have shrunk by over a decade, while others have grown by a similar magnitude. In the sectorial arms race, there are more losers than winners. Corporate advantage and investor opportunity blend more than expected. Corporate growth rates determine sector weighting in cap-weighted portfolios, which drives passive investor exposures, pushing up de facto valuations. On the coming watershed, winners and losers should not be judged by success in the intensity of the economic downturn or the pace and extent of recovery. High-frequency tasks can be executed by computers. Management facing a timetable defined by trading sessions must make time for strategic deliberation. Corporate strategy will be preemptive or reactive. Social and cultural shifts. The COVID-19 pandemic had a fundamental effect on countless relationships, altering how individuals manage close and interpersonal relationships, communicate with and understand the people in their social networks, particularly in relation to aging and multi-generational relationships, social media, work and social hierarchies, and the valuation of empathy. The global response to the pandemic affects not only the rapidly changing environments requiring constant adjustments, but also social relationships, power structures, and social distances. This changing social environment demands flexibility and adaptability as individuals struggle throughout the pandemic to maintain ties in various relationships, maintaining caring as a central identity in various types of caring rather than a mere strategy. The perception of age and multi-generational relationships in societies experiencing pandemic stress is influenced by various historically experienced forms of generational division. Repercussions in relationships between healthcare workers and those in their care, and subsequently between those employed to provide caring roles and the public they serve, are observed. The availability of alternative coping strategies by changing attitudes and rhythms of the use of free time, combined with the differential policy support, advances the capacity of peers and older family members, gender, and the accompanying commitment for care required by families in the communities deserving of socially sanctioned living wages, who receive a systematically discounted rate of public profit necessary to cope with the unique challenges these groups present. As social distancing measures forced organizations to rethink and reorganize how work gets done, Rigid office hours and work schedules came to an end for significant portions of the workforce. By early 2021, roughly 42% of all employees were working from home. Although momentum has since waned during the year, remote work shouldered its way into many occupations that had once been thought incompatible with alternative work arrangements. In part, the experiences of employees during the pandemic opened new possibilities for who can now work remotely and the extent to which remote work can be done. The accelerant was undoubtedly technological progress, which enabled employees to stay connected and productive in an off-the-office environment. Indeed, corporate investments in software dedicated to collaboration and productivity during the pandemic were colossal and remain much higher than the norm. Remote work challenges the basic management tenets of firm efficiency, which suggest that in-person supervision is uniquely effective at fostering coordination, supporting career development and training opportunities, stimulating creativity, and generally assuring adequate skill development. Time will tell whether remote work succeeded in breaking new ground on some of these management issues. Certainly, workers generally appear quite upbeat about their ability to telework, with many insisting that some form of remote work be a part of the longer-term equilibrium between work and family. The intimate relationship that employees enjoy with home ownership, even younger or newer employees, has engendered disbelief in the real estate industry that the big city office has a future. Time will tell whether the pandemic has sufficiently catalyzed the acceptance of remote work across organizations and up and down the ranks of employees. One of the most palpable changes due to COVID-19 has been a transformation in the use of technology. Video platforms rapidly replaced in-person meetings around the world, online commerce surged, and robots increasingly took on work to protect humans from unnecessary contact. Adoption of apps for contact tracing changed habits and ways in which personal health and location data were shared, raising collective privacy concerns. New issues have arisen as less wealthy countries adopt e-governance. Internet access is increased in regions where it is currently unavailable, and in the forward shift of technological change that happened during the crisis. Leveling the playing field among small and large businesses and across nations may require addressing these concerns and protecting public goods. COVID-19 has caused some nations, companies, and people to leapfrog into the future, adopting technologies and changing habits that increase productivity and competitiveness long-term. For example, the crisis may accelerate digitization in Latin America and countries in Eastern Europe by a full 5 years, compared with the pace of pre-COVID times, and many local small businesses will be irretrievably harmed. In recent decades, the most successful firms have been concentrated in specific sectors and call for more competition. In the future, there may be more space for disruptive startups and small and medium enterprises, and for leapfrogging gains to improve overall country competitiveness. COVID-constructed platforms will drive our circulation of information, goods, and knowledge. This stands in stark opposition to anti-globalism and vaccine nationalism. The reduction of global supply chains may de-risk some aspects of major economies, but it will also diminish their agility. Technologically agile platforms constructed across international boundaries will drive wealth in a digitally connected future. It's not only the technology platforms that will be vital, it's also their scale in large addressable markets and the density of human connectivity that will determine the flow of wealth in the next 50 years. The COVID era has rewritten our relationship between digital platforms and government intervention. The US and its allies, examples of how COVID-era governments have changed their attitudes toward digital platforms. COVID-19 has rewritten our governance relationship between the global, national, regional, and local levels. The operating speed for international interventions has proven acutely slow, with national governments forced to direct immediate lockdowns, healthcare infrastructure build and discovery. The speed advantages of regional control within a nation-state have been both demonstrated and realized in achieving outcomes that matter to their electorate. In particular, the COVID-19 era has shown governments in an increasingly urbanized world that the level of local city administration is where the rapid interventions must lie. The guide of Follow the Data will drive a recognition of where the pandemic-level interventions, as originally actioned by many nation-states, are rebalanced with tactical operations located within their cities. The legacy of this move from COVID-era governance towards city regionalism will have major future implications. Ever since the first schools opened thousands of years ago, education has been delivered in much the same way. A teacher standing in front of a class of students in a designated classroom. The pandemic forced the world to explore alternative ways to deliver education, particularly at the higher level. Telecommuting, electronic communication, and video conferencing have become part of our working lives, and those tools are now assiduously used in the education sector as well. Just as the retail and entertainment industries had already started to change prior to the pandemic, the world of education was shifting as well. But COVID-19 came along and sped up the change. It is now expected that a sizable portion of students at an increasing number of educational institutions in a steadily growing number of countries will pursue their studies off campus. As education becomes more modular and digital platforms begin to disaggregate credentials from the archetypal diploma, the education sector segmentally evolves from being principally artisanal and customized in nature to encompass mass education, where large datasets, machine learning, and AI drive the customization of educational content. Form follows function, and societal perceptions of education are changing as well. Today, education is heard, not seen. As the pandemic keeps a firm grip over the world, online learning platforms have seen an explosive rise in use, with students, teachers, and parents relying on them for educational continuity and support. Many are questioning whether the pandemic has changed education forever and whether these platforms will become standard in classrooms worldwide. To answer that question, it may be more resourceful to hear from the people who have actually had to put online learning platforms to use and have some experiences with them. A massive multi-party online dialogue involving over 63,000 people, including students, teachers, and education administrators alike from over 100 countries, has attempted to do just that. These professionals have been using the platforms and are the ones who have to work with them. Their lecture on how the platforms perform and whether they are valuable tools could have some important implications for the future of education. The COVID-19 virus is one of thousands of previously unknown viral species that live in association with humans and other animals and plants. It has, by accident, benefited Earth's environment by reducing human activities, such as production and transportation, that emit greenhouse gases. The current reduction in human activities has also highlighted how global tourism can perpetrate misbehaviors, especially when human population densities are high. We discuss here that there are consequences and adjustments needed for society, wildlife, and natural areas as the world begins to heal from both the virus and the unintentional boosts that the virus has provided to Earth's environment. The future of environmental monitoring and stewardship is a mixed bag of increased challenges, technologies, and prioritization. How and how well society has adjusted to the pandemic, and how essential Earth's varied environments and wildlife are as the pandemic plays out among humans, is clearly seen by the up and down impact on each other since 2019. As pandemics and environmental issues, including anthropogenic climate disruption, are compound, intermittent, and evolving, managing and stewarding satisfactory human and wildlife cohabitation throughout Earth's varied environments relies on societies. Socioeconomic and healthcare issues are clearly important as the hidden and not always appreciated backdrop of immediately preceding pandemics, and now pandemics is climate change. Combined pandemics, environmental issues, and eco-stresses have immediate and longer-term impacts on each other as all ripple through human society and ecosystems. COVID-19 is a reminder that pandemics, however unwelcome, connect society to the environment, mediate climate, and functionally impact present and future human health. COVID is current, it is immediate, it is economic, and it is a part of our medical reality that must be managed. but it is the mark of viruses, including the well-known cousin viruses, the rhinoviruses, coronaviruses, and influenza viruses, that the mammalian epithelium should be a prime target. It is common knowledge that the COVID-19 pandemic put a damper on the global economy, leading to fewer transportation and industrial activities and hence to a considerable decline in pollution levels worldwide. Thus, the pandemic induced in a matter of a few months a change in the levels of atmospheric pollution comparable to that envisaged by international organizations in decades-long roadmaps. Atmospheric pollutants and greenhouse gases decreased notably everywhere. Not only in countries in lockdown, the impact mainly depends on the reducing activity of the transport sector and the industrial shutdown. Scientists who monitor pollution from space have published numerous dramatic images showing how the current pandemic and the instituted containment measures have induced radical reductions in pollution levels worldwide. The most reflected pollution monitoring parameter depends on the assessment method and the years under comparison. Air quality monitoring networks, satellite observations, and independent analyses provide either similar or only sometimes contrasting highways of detection. Locally measured air quality data show that with lockdown and travel restrictions, the concentration of nitrogen oxides decreases in the urban environment, generally with high reductions in the range within some tens of percentages, looking very often also due to strong reductions in the emission rates of the transport sector. Demand for electricity has decreased in lockdown periods with corresponding reductions in the emissions of carbon dioxide, and efforts to reduce CO2 emissions in the electricity sector have started, although the primary challenge of putting the global economy back on track will probably postpone the urgency of climate change mitigation. Global CO2 emissions in 2020 experienced an unprecedented decrease equal to 7% with respect to 2019. The power sector was one of the hardest hit by the pandemic, causing a significant decrease in CO2 emissions. COVID-19 has further damaged the already fragile relations between the United States and China. Americans, already apoplectic over the rapid loss of their economic primacy, have identified the virus as one of the major reasons for the decline. China's autocratic governance proved two important points. The first was that without the entanglement of meeting the demands of fashionable social themes, it was able to act more freely in dealing with the pandemic. The second was that the regime's actions call into question American democratic dogma that asserts that it is the best system that everyone should adopt. The American reaction has been very apparent. While Beijing was able to conjure up the miracle of constructing a new hospital in just 4 days, the United States was unable even to put together an emergency reserve of necessary supplies, clearly showing the difference in the quality of their respective political systems. It was just as apparent that China was the first victim rather than the perpetrator of the pandemic itself, as so many in the United States were now saying. As in any crisis, all effort is focused inwards. In the race for political survival, democracy seems to be made of much weaker stuff than everyone thought. The big negative in the equation goes to the liberals and progressives, who have lost their momentum just as quickly as they gained it. Governmental policies and leadership, central coordination, quick response and mass discipline were what conquered the virus in totalitarian China and its little neighbor Singapore. In late February of that year, the number of infected in Singapore was quickly mounting as over 1,000 infections were confirmed. The government quickly engaged itself, arranging special dormitories, which reduced the exposure risks for migrant workers to a minimum, and the officials ensured that the measures were adhered to. Contacts with all infected were traced, they were quickly hospitalized, and the spread of the disease among the population quickly died off. However, by the end of 2020, there were several times fewer people who became infected in China and in Singapore. The quick response of their governments worked just like in the case of these two states in several other countries. Another 20 states managed to realize that the virus was dangerous, to grow a sense of danger, to put the entire population on a war footing, to introduce reasonable constraints immediately, and to observe their implementation. In 19 of them, it was due to a respect for leaders who disposed of almost unlimited power. In Estonia, it was the institutional setup that allowed the health minister to act immediately without any constraints with the support of the medical establishment. These leaders based their governance on recommendations from science, giving mandatory guidelines the same. The rest of the heads of democratic states cut off half of their political wings, paying respect to the two parts of their societies, which differed by a completely distinct understanding of a more important human right, the right to life, among other things. Neither first responder was thinking of the idea of respecting a different sort of view. COVID-19 has had significant mental health effects. The anxiety surrounding the uncertainty and fear of getting the virus persists, bringing depression and insomnia. The pandemic effects are compounded by the fear for mental well-being and the stigma associated with having the virus. There is increased uncertainty about the psychological well-being of the global population. Beyond the specific population effects of psychological disorders and negative emotions due to COVID-19, tragic emotional consequences arise from the vast number of people who have died. People are dying at home due to missed COVID-19 diagnoses, overwhelmed healthcare systems, or refusal to go to the hospital for fear of contracting the virus, causing difficult grief in isolation. The simple laws of supply and demand lead to less sleep, decreased quality of sleep, and increased sleep latency. There is reduced physical activity, increased sedentarism, and associated negative feelings that accompany it. The pandemic has made us less social beings due to prolonged separation from family and friends and disproportionate impacts affecting people without companions. In the long term, we should see a significant mental health burden and its effects on the public and the economy. The economic turmoil will be a direct burden, but the loss of supportive social environments and networks will also have lasting emotional costs. The significant effects of post-traumatic stress disorder and depression from the SARS pandemic demonstrate long-term mental health consequences. The simple isolation factor is incredibly hard on mental health. There has been a significant increase in screen time usage of smartphones and other devices to maintain contact and socialize through digital means. Digital contact can't replace real physical interaction. The elderly or disabled persons with chronic conditions are disproportionately affected. Additionally, we see an increase in domestic violence incidents and child abuse. Social restrictions have allowed cases to escalate and become more violent, dangerous, and difficult to escape. With the shortened fuse people have in their stress, tempers grow short, even leading to violence outside. The distinction in minority groups further shines through as stark health disparities in adult racial and ethnic minority populations have become a significant burden. At the same time, underrepresented minorities also experience an increased mental health burden directly facing the stress of death and infection, grieving isolation, and economic upheaval. These minority groups don't have the privilege of social distancing, as they're often essential workers who are more frequently those laid off or furloughed. The stigma of the virus itself and healthcare usage keeps people from seeking care and treatment. Explanations have been consistent across the globe. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted travel and working patterns and increased consumer awareness of the importance of taking care of the home. As the first turbulence appeared, most people found themselves isolated and anxious, but many then adjusted to the new lifestyle and environment and found that there were benefits. Nonetheless, many people still had great difficulty in dealing with the new environment, being away from the office or taking long, sometimes costly and potentially risky commutes to and from work. The prospect of developing long-term relationships with customers or colleagues under the paradigm of always or semi-permanently being on the other side of a connection was deeply troubling for many. Many people living in crowded, noisy, and expensive cities opened their closets at the end of the first quarantine period and found that their professional clothes, which were only comfortable for about 1 hour a day, constituted 90% of their wardrobe. They worked out how to move into a single-family home with a healthy backyard where they could build a comfortable home office with privacy. The result was a European version of the suburban exodus. Future preparedness and resilience. The COVID-19 pandemic has taught country leaders, public health officials, international organizations, and the wider global community many bitter lessons about the challenges of pandemic prevention, preparedness, response, and resilience. The efforts needed to address this pandemic have moved preparedness and resilience to the top of the public health priorities in many countries. The global system is also waking up to the need for improved collective efforts. Institutional change, the revitalization of the public health security paradigm, the reform of the international health regulations, and the strengthening of the World Health Organization, search for new and innovative approaches, and the establishment of new mechanisms, all are high on the agendas formulated by international organizations and expert bodies. The initiatives, implementing arrangements, institutional creations, and other policy measures taken to address the pandemic and its future implications are numerous and complex. So are the emerging debates on what happened and what needs to be done. The international consensus on core issues continues to be partial, and controversial issues remain. Country and nationalistic considerations further complicate the debates. Nevertheless, it is clear that in the pandemic's aftermath, people are thinking differently. The public, and particularly health professionals, are taking the novel coronavirus's next move into account. They are taking preparedness seriously, procuring stockpiles, ensuring that they are of high quality and strategically located, aligning procurement, warehousing, transportation, and distribution processes with the need to sustain supplies to handle long and flexible pandemics, and reviewing and restructuring public health capabilities in the light of the many lessons learned during the pandemic are becoming top priorities in many countries. Updates and improvements of the international systems for disease monitoring, vigilance, and the exchange of epidemiological information are also being emphasized as critical preparedness tools. Lessons learned and recommendations. What lessons have been reinforced by the pandemic that are important for disaster managers responding to future events? How have we become better prepared for other disasters due to lessons learned from and preparations made for COVID-19? What have we learned that we should always consider when developing procedural or response changes for future issues? Our collective pandemic experience has begun to help inform the broader public health and safety community on appropriate response actions. Many re-evaluations of lessons learned will continue as the pandemic persists. Our understanding of evolving variants and the efficacy of vaccinations continues to develop, and vaccinations or potential vaccination mandates are considered and discussed. Recommendations in this chapter may also be revisited as potential future disaster policy revisions. Vulnerabilities and their potential mitigation strategies are considered, if not already available or in place. They do not represent all lessons learned or potential issues that may be raised longer term, but provide a start. Although the pandemic and the associated large-scale response are unprecedented in modern history, certain themes have been reinforced. These include the need for continued strong national, state, and local public-private partnerships, as well as a whole-of-government response, effective pre-disaster planning and coordination, robust post-disaster situational awareness, and preparedness that understands and respects the legal structures that govern our federal system. Although responses to public health-related and other types of disasters are quite different, lessons learned from crises such as the pandemic should influence not only public health policy discussions and post-disaster federal disaster assistance decision-making in the future, but also formal and informal activities such as disaster housing assistance that were used for the first time since the Category 5 hurricane in non-traditional disaster areas. Our leaders should consider using a broad but informed perspective when deliberating how to implement policy changes from the pandemic, however controversial and politically charged they may be. Federal disaster assistance for presidentially declared events provided through the Stafford Act takes many forms that do not just assist states or local jurisdictions that are unable to respond. They also help unbalanced state economies due to unusual needs, as well as help other entities such as non-profits, businesses, and certain categories of individuals. Conclusion. As it is with all significant changes in history, the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic are still hard to fully comprehend. By restricting the movement of individuals globally, COVID-19 decreased carbon dioxide emissions, reduced air pollution, and all the other effects of the actions of the Anthropocene era on the Earth. Although this effect is likely to be temporary and recognition of climate change happened decades before the COVID-19 pandemic, this event has emphasized the effect the individual has on the wider world. Unfortunately, the pandemic also affected the most basic levels of life. The pandemic spread at a faster pace than any news or data, and quarantines have kept individuals isolated as they were never before. By every definition known to sociology or social psychology students, there is no example of an isolation of such magnitude in human history. After experiencing these effects on such an exponential level, will the conscience of mankind really change? A great human wall of privilege has been erected to protect societies, creating people on the inside feeling very privileged and the ones on the outside angry and resentful. The division of modern society is now brought into sharp and painful focus. The pandemic has given us a historic test, and by a metric of how much money is thrown into trying to fix the problem and how many people are tested or contract the virus, we have failed it. We have allowed ourselves to be divided not by the fact of the disease, but by politics, religion, and money. Indeed, if the legacy of the pandemic leads to mankind taking a closer look at itself and judging our relationships with each other a little differently, we may come out the other side with our humanity and our societies strengthened instead of weakened. Key takeaways. Long-term impact. COVID-19 has been the black swan event of 2020 to 2022, with long-lasting repercussions for the world and for the way business is done. Fears and concerns around health and mobility during the COVID-19 crisis might have sown the seeds of a long-term move toward reshoring, greater prioritization of global systemic risks. COVID-19 has triggered incredible volatility in financial markets. The lesson learned is that markets are very much risk-on versus focusing on the full spectrum that can be presented as a problem. In addition to financial risk, societal, health, and environmental risks all came to the forefront at the same time. This greater emphasis on what might be termed systemic global risks from banks and policymakers will certainly signal a return to the relevance of multilaterals, the role of institutions, and the increasing importance of bilateral relationships, return to the essentials of economies. Employment has been a very direct and clearly demonstrated priority of governments during the pandemic. Making sure societies were protected and able to spend well was of primary importance in this crisis. This approach is likely to flow through to future government policies and will remain a key feature of international economic dynamics in 2020 to 2022. While employment was a key theme even before the dislocation, the acceleration through the COVID-19 crisis will ensure that social protection and expansion of public and private protocols will be a long-term problem. COVID-19 changed the world in ways we never imagined. From reshaping the global economy to altering our daily lives, its legacy will endure for generations. Watch this video to explore how the pandemic has transformed society, our workplaces, and our future. Subscribe and hit the bell to stay informed about world-changing events.